Before sunrise on January 17, 1991, the waters of the northern Persian Gulf were unnaturally still. Even the routine hum of merchant traffic seemed muted, as though the entire region sensed that the first hours of the air campaign against Saddam Hussein's Iraq were about to expose something far more shocking than bombs falling on Baghdad. A handful of Soviet naval observers, stationed aboard Iraqi-aligned vessels and at military attaché posts in the region, had expected to witness a messy, grinding contest between Iraq's sizable fleet and America's multinational naval force. Instead, what they experienced in those early hours overturned decades of Soviet assumptions about naval warfare. For years, Soviet analysts had portrayed the Iraqi Navy as crude but capable. A force built around missile-armed fast attack craft, mine layers, and patrol boats equipped with Styx and Searsucker anti-ship missiles. On paper, these weapons posed a legitimate threat to any Western fleet. Soviet advisors had trained Iraqi crews through the 1970s and early 1980s, emphasizing saturation tactics and bold, high-speed ambushes. If war ever came, Moscow expected Iraq to rely on sudden missile volleys and coordinated small boat attacks designed to overwhelm technologically superior opponents with sheer aggression. The observers in the Gulf believed they were about to watch those doctrines play out. But in the first hours before sunrise, something else happened, something that would deeply unsettle them. Instead of massed Iraqi missile boats surging forward, the Soviet observers saw almost nothing. American patrol aircraft and surface combatants were moving with a precision and confidence the Soviets found unnerving. They noted how U.S. Aegis cruisers and destroyers maintained radar silence until moments of action, coordinated across secure digital links that Iraq had no means of disrupting. Soviet analysts had long emphasized the resilience of analog systems, but here the Americans appeared to be operating on a completely different plane. Information-driven, networked, fast, and surgical. What unsettled the Soviet observers most was not the speed of destruction, that would come shortly, but the total absence of Iraqi initiative. It felt, even then, as if the Americans were shaping the battlespace long before any shots were fired. The realization that U.S. forces were already dismantling Iraq's entire decision cycle before combat began would become brutally clear once the first vessels were engaged. And that growing sense of unease is where the story now turns next. As the first streaks of twilight brushed the horizon, the Americans initiated what Soviet observers would later describe as a textbook demonstration of preemption through maritime dominance. Long before the Iraqi Navy realized it had been targeted, U.S. naval aviation had already mapped every significant Iraqi vessel, minefield, and patrol route. P-3 Orions, operating from high altitude and well outside the range of Iraqi air defenses, used infrared sensors and magnetic anomaly detectors to confirm ship movements. At the same time, U.S. Navy SEALs covertly operating near Iraqi coastal facilities fed real-time intelligence into the wider network. Soviet officers watching from regional command posts noted with growing discomfort that this intelligence picture was not being shared over traditional radio net chatter. It was clean, silent, encrypted, and unified across every American operational element. That unity became obvious when the first strikes began. At approximately 4:30 local time, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aircraft moved in synchrony, hitting Iraqi naval bases at Qasr and the Al-Faw Peninsula with laser-guided munitions. The strikes were not designed to obliterate bases but to blind them, destroying radars, communications masts, and command posts. When the fires first lit the coastline, the Soviet observers realized that many Iraqi vessels had already been rendered deaf and directionless. The Iraqi Navy was not being defeated at sea, it was being disarmed before it could even sortie. Just minutes later, the first direct naval engagements began. A group of Iraqi minesweepers and fast attack craft attempted to maneuver north of Bubiyan Island, hoping to reposition or flee toward Iranian waters. But their movements were hardly secret. US E-2C Hawkeye early warning aircraft tracked every turn, relaying precise vectors to American surface combatants. At 5 o'clock, USS Nicholas, FFG-47, operating with near-total situational clarity, fired the opening salvo using SM-1 Mr. Surface-to-Air missiles in surface mode, a capability the Soviets had underestimated for years. Within seconds, one Iraqi minesweeper was burning. Within minutes, a second was disabled. What disturbed Soviet analysts most was not merely the accuracy of the American strikes. but how effortlessly the various U.S. platforms worked in unison. It was not a ship fighting another ship. It was an entire digitally connected architecture systematically dismantling a navy that still relied on voice radio and manual plot boards. This growing asymmetry, already evident in the first engagements, set the stage for the far more devastating encounters that followed when Iraqi missile boats attempted to break through the chaos and retaliate. The attempted breakout of Iraq's missile-armed fast attack craft should have been the moment their navy demonstrated its long-trained doctrines: ambush, speed, and overwhelming missile salvos. The OSA and TNC-45 boats that Iraq had acquired from the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia were built for precisely this role, closing fast, firing sticks or seersucker missiles from standoff range, and forcing opponents into defensive chaos. Yet as the Iraqi vessels pushed south from the core Abd Allah waterway, Soviet observers watching their radar tracks noticed something deeply troubling. The boats were maneuvering erratically, their formation fractured, and their attempts to coordinate missile launches were disjointed. The reason soon became clear. American electronic warfare was already peeling apart their situational awareness. At 5:20, as the first group of Iraqi missile boats reached open water north of Bubiyan Island, U.S. aircraft began coordinated strikes designed to neutralize their missile capability before they could fire. A-6E intruders and F divided by a -18S approached from multiple angles, using low-level ingress routes that exploited the gaps in Iraqi radar coverage created earlier by the pre-dawn strikes. Soviet observers noted that several Iraqi radar operators reported ghost contacts, a symptom of jamming and deceptive electronic signatures. In contrast, American pilots had a flawless target picture fed by Hawkeyes orbiting far to the south, a level of coherence the Soviets had long theorized but rarely seen executed so completely. Within minutes, the first Harpoon missiles were launched. Their flight profiles were disciplined and unervingly precise. Sea-skimming, low observable, and arriving from angles the Iraqi boats were poorly positioned to counter. The impact was immediate. One Iraqi TNC-45, attempting to turn broadside to bring its missile tubes to bear, was struck amidships and erupted into flames. Another, trying to retreat toward Iraqi territorial waters, was immobilized by a precision strike that cut its propulsion. Soviet officers quietly acknowledged that these were not random kills. They were targeted removals of the vessels most capable of launching anti-ship missiles. What truly unsettled the Soviet observers, however, was the speed with which the Iraqi Navy's offensive potential collapsed. In less than half an hour, what had been Iraq's main missile-armed contingent was reduced to scattered survivors whose communications were degraded and whose situational awareness had all but evaporated. The Americans were not simply outgunning them. They were preventing a fight before it could materialize. And as the Gulf slowly brightened with the first light of dawn, U.S. surface combatants began moving in for the next phase, intercepting the remnants fleeing toward Iranian waters or attempting to hide among the islands. That confrontation would reveal an even deeper imbalance in naval warfare, one that Soviet intelligence could neither ignore nor easily explain away. By the time the sun finally pushed above the Gulf horizon, the battle had shifted from missile duels to something far more revealing: a systematic pursuit and neutralization of every remaining Iraqi vessel attempting to escape the chaos around Bubiyan Island. Soviet observers had expected the Iraqi Navy, trained in swarm tactics and decentralized finesse, to scatter, regroup, and counterattack from new angles. But instead, the Iraqi formations dissolved almost instantly. Their remaining patrol craft, minesweepers, and missile boats fled on divergent bearings, many making desperate attempts to slip into Iranian territorial waters to avoid further strikes. But what the Soviets witnessed next reshaped their understanding of American maritime warfare more than the strikes themselves. American surface combatants, particularly the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates deployed in the northern Gulf, moved with coordinated precision. USS Kurtz, FFG-38, USS Nicholas, FFG-47, and USS Jarrett, FFG-33, tracked separate clusters of Iraqi boats while sharing a common operational picture that allowed them to act without hesitation or redundant targeting. Each vessel operated not as an individual combatant but as a node in a larger system, a concept the Soviets recognized but had never seen demonstrated with such fluidity. At 6:15, Kurtz engaged an Iraqi minesweeper attempting to flee northeast. The engagement was over in moments. A volley of 76mm shells, followed by a helicopter-launched Penguin missile, left the vessel ablaze. Meanwhile, Nicholas, already responsible for the early destruction of 2 Iraqi ships before dawn, intercepted another group of patrol boats attempting to skirt the shallow waters near the Iranian border. Soviet observers noted the unsettling quiet in the American communications network. Short, coded bursts, rather than the lengthy voice transmissions typical of Soviet and Iraqi vessels. It suggested a level of digital integration the Soviet fleet had not yet achieved. The most telling moment, however, came when Iraqi ships attempted to hide among the small islands and muddy inlets of the Bubiyan archipelago. This tactic had long been part of Soviet naval teaching. Use geography, reduce radar visibility, force the enemy into close-range engagements. But USSH 60B Seahawk helicopters, using both infrared sensors and radar, identified these positions within minutes. One fleeing Iraqi fast attack craft, invisible to surface radar due to its proximity to land, was spotted from the air and destroyed with a single Penguin missile. To the Soviet analysts, this represented a doctrinal collapse. Geography itself no longer provided refuge. What the Soviets were beginning to understand, though only dimly in that moment, was that the U.S. Navy had effectively insulated itself from surprise. Its surveillance network, its integration between sea and air platforms, and its disciplined execution removed any possibility of an Iraqi counterstrike. And as the final Iraqi vessels attempted their last, desperate maneuvers, the decisive blow, the one that would end the Iraqi Navy as a strategic force, was about to unfold. The final act of the battle unfolded with a clarity that left Soviet observers stunned, not because of the scale of destruction but because of the unmistakable message it carried. The Iraqi Navy no longer existed as a fighting force. What remained was a scattered collection of vessels either disabled, fleeing, or moments away from being detected and destroyed. The decisive blow came shortly after 7 o'clock, when U.S. naval forces targeted the largest and most capable Iraqi warships still attempting to escape, including several well-armed fast attack craft that, in theory, should have posed serious danger to any surface combatant. One of the most telling encounters involved the Iraqi T-43 minesweeper moored near the Khor Abd Allah Inlet. While technically a minesweeper, the vessel had been pressed into broader patrol roles and carried enough weaponry to threaten lighter ships. It attempted to flee northward, taking advantage of shallow channels believed to be too risky for American surface combatants. Yet this assumption did not hold against the fused American surveillance picture. A Seahawk helicopter deployed from USS Nicholas detected the vessel's heat signature, confirmed identification through radar cross-section analysis, and relayed precise coordinates to the frigate. Moments later, a single Penguin anti-ship missile struck the minesweeper, setting it alight before it could reach a defensible position. Farther south, another Iraqi fast attack craft attempted a similar escape. Soviet analysts, watching radar returns from regional facilities, noted that the Iraqi vessels were no longer maneuvering tactically, they were simply running. Several boats tried to use the clutter of shallow coastal waters and the proximity of Iranian maritime borders as shields. But the Americans, rather than blindly pursuing, slowed their advance and allowed airborne assets to funnel the escaping vessels back toward open water, where surface ships could engage without risk. This patient, methodical approach contrasted sharply with the Soviet doctrine of aggressive pursuit, revealing yet another shift in modern naval thought. By the late morning, the tally of destroyed Iraqi vessels was unprecedented. More than a dozen ships, including minesweepers, fast attack craft, and patrol boats, had been sunk or disabled without inflicting a single loss on U.S. naval forces. The asymmetry was so pronounced that Soviet officers privately questioned whether any Soviet-equipped fleet could have fared differently under such conditions. The issue was no longer Iraq's competence but the structural mismatch between analog-era doctrine and digital-era warfare. As the last plumes of smoke drifted above the Gulf, one stark truth became unavoidable. The Iraqi Navy had been crushed before sunrise, not through overwhelming firepower alone, but through an operational system that the Soviets could no longer ignore. And that realization pushed them toward a deeper strategic question, one that would define their analysis for years to come. For Soviet observers reviewing the after-action reports in the days that followed, the destruction of the Iraqi Navy was more than a tactical defeat. It was a revelation that struck at the foundations of their own maritime doctrine. The Soviet Union had long assumed that regional navies equipped with Soviet-built vessels and trained in Soviet-style tactics could at least mount a contested fight against Western fleets. But the Gulf War shattered that assumption. The Americans had not merely outmaneuvered an inferior opponent. They had demonstrated an entirely new model of naval warfare in which information dominance, joint integration, and precision engagement neutralized conventional threats before they could meaningfully respond. The Soviet analysts began by examining the engagement timelines. In every case, from the early morning destruction of minesweepers to the mid-morning elimination of missile boats, U.S. forces acted with decision cycles measured in seconds, not minutes. The combination of airborne early warning, electronic warfare, satellite reconnaissance, and digitally linked surface combatants created what Soviet reports increasingly referred to as a continuous battlespace. There were no gaps for Iraq to exploit, no blind spots to ambush, and no isolated American units vulnerable to saturation attack. Instead, each U.S. asset amplified the others, creating a layered, overlapping network that reduced Iraq's navy to a series of vulnerable nodes. Their internal assessments also focused on electronic warfare. While Iraq possessed Soviet design systems intended to track, jam, or disrupt incoming threats, these tools were calibrated for earlier-generation Western radars and communications. The U.S. Navy's use of secure digital links, frequency-hopping radios, and integrated jamming rendered Iraqi detection systems nearly obsolete. Soviet engineers reading the intelligence summaries recognized an uncomfortable truth. Electronic warfare was no longer a contest of power but of sophistication, and the American lead in this domain was growing rapidly. Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion concerned missile employment. For decades, Soviet doctrine had emphasized the decisive impact of anti-ship missile volleys, believing that a sudden barrage could overwhelm even the most advanced Western vessels. Yet the Iraqi Navy, despite being equipped with variants of the very missile families the Soviets considered central to modern naval combat, never managed to launch an effective salvo. Their targeting networks were blinded, their firing platforms isolated, and their command structure fragmented before an organized missile launch could occur. This failure was not merely Iraqi, it represented a structural flaw in the entire Soviet approach to maritime strike operations. By the time the final assessments reached Moscow, one phrase appeared repeatedly in classified commentary. The Americans did not win through firepower alone. They won because they never allowed a battle to develop. For a military establishment that had spent decades preparing to counter mass naval engagements, this realization signaled a doctrinal reckoning. The Gulf War did not expose a single vulnerability. It exposed an entire system outpaced by a competitor operating on the front edge of the information age. And as Soviet naval officers reflected on the smoke rising over Bubiyan Island and the wrecks scattered along the shallow Gulf waters, they understood that Iraq's defeat was not an anomaly. It was a preview. A preview of a world in which traditional metrics of fleet strength mattered far less than integration, timing, and data. A preview of conflicts where the side that shaped the battlespace before dawn would determine the outcome long before the first missile ever left its launcher.